common sense, 10 years from now, common sense will be different, right? 50 years ago, it was common sense that, I like to tell a story. Okay, so 100 years ago, it was commonsensical to think that girls should not learn as much as boys. And that's because some people thought, not only in terms of economic competition and for jobs, but also that it might make girls emotionally unstable, psychologically, it might even make you infertile. Like, it would have all of these problems, right? And this was kind of the common sense that it would be problematic for girls to learn too much. And 50 years ago, the common sense was we shouldn't teach students of color as much, right? Some people, again, felt it was because of competition for jobs, but other people felt they just weren't as smart. The whole bell curve argument, right, kind of comes out of that ideology, right? That some people just aren't capable. Well, today we look back and we say, wow, that's kind of ridiculous, right? It's incredibly sexist and racist. Why? And of course we don't think that anymore. But not many people would have questioned it back then. It was taken for granted. And it raises the question 50 years from now, how might we look back on today and say, I can't believe people thought that, right? And I would say 50 years from now, hopefully people will look back and say, I can't believe people thought that competition was going to solve everything. Yes. I can't believe people thought that standardized tests is a valid and helpful measure and we should tie everything to them. Standardized tests shows us some things. I don't want to say it's completely useless, but to tie everything to test scores is just so narrow, right? Alright, I would also argue that you can go anywhere around the world. So some of my own writings, I begin by talking about how when I travel, one of the things I'm struck by is that I don't have common sense in those contexts, right? Common sense is the sense that gets developed by a particular group in a particular time to navigate that context, right? That's what common sense means, right? It's a group that we develop for right here, right now, for how we navigate this context, right? So it's not surprising that halfway around the world, what people think is common sense is not the same as what I think right here, right? It's also why 50 years from now the common sense is likely to be different. But it also is why the common sense is often what justifies the status quo, right? It's how we make sense of and navigate the status quo, right? Common sense is not, you'd have a very unstable society if the common sense was something that constantly forced you to question the status quo, right? That's not often the common sense. Common sense might say we're always going to have dissenting opinions, right? Common sense does not necessarily say you should be constantly one of those dissenters, right? So I do think that common sense is going to always reflect things that justify and rationalize the status quo. And I think that's why, a lot of my own writings is about saying we need to, part of our job as educators and as just critical citizens is to constantly question common sense, right?
May I ask you how you came up with, or what prompted you to develop the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education?
So Center for Anti-Oppressive Education is something I created in 2002.
Okay.
Let's see, how do I tell this story? I used to, I've jumped around a lot, right?
Okay.
I've taught, and then I taught as a professor, and then I did the center, and then I worked in a union, and then I'm back in higher ed.
Okay.
And when I started the center, I really had in my mind this idea that I wanted to try to have an impact on education much more broadly than the impact that I felt I was having in the college that I was at, in the community that I was at the time. So I wanted to have kind of a more nationwide impact, and I also wanted to try to impact more how we prepare new teachers. Because there's a lot of organizations like NAME that does a lot for practicing teachers. In fact, there's a lot of organizations that support practicing teachers who are trying to do social justice, anti-oppressive stuff. So anti-oppressive is a term that I use to kind of, it's like an umbrella term, right? It's challenging racism, challenging sexism, challenging heterosexism, classism, all these isms, right? All these anti-racist, anti-classist teachings fall under this large umbrella of anti-oppressive teaching. So, so I wanted to create something that was really going to help me influence how we prepare teachers, and that's why I created the center. So, one of the big things that I've done over the past almost 10 years now is run an annual conference. Which is it's called the International Conference on Teacher Education and Social Justice, which I'm actually now running right now because I'm running the NAME conferences. But, but that was one way that I tried to kind of intervene in what was going on, right?
Okay.
And that's also, you know, for a while I did that full time, so I was doing a lot of traveling around the country and working a lot at universities to try to say, well, here's what I think it means to prepare teachers to address diversity and bias and injustice in the world, in schools and in the world. Yeah, right now it isn't, I'm not doing too much with the center, mainly because I'm devoting a lot more of my time to name. Yeah.
Understandable. But it's still great though, and I mean, actually that leads into my final question for you would be, you know, what would be your advice for future teachers, especially future teachers that plan to or want to teach in, you know, ethnically, culturally diverse students?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
If you had some words of wisdom.
Just a one sentence and no. Just
No, we love it.
Let me say two quick things.
Yes,
I think
awesome.
one thing I would say is really working that contradiction that we talked about earlier is one piece of advice that I would urge people to take very seriously, right? So what does it mean to walk in with a lot of confidence that I have learned a lot about differences, but that I have a lot more to learn? Or that I have a lot to teach these students, but I'm going to help them to question everything that I teach, right? I mean, I think really working that contradiction is something that I find very liberating, right? Because I think, you know, there's this book by Elizabeth Ellsworth, who's one of my advisors, called Teaching Positions.
Okay.
And one of the things that she argues in Teaching Positions is that teaching is impossible. And she argues that teaching is impossible so long as we think that teaching is about you learning what I want you to learn. Right? Because that never happens. It never happens because what I teach is always more than what I'm trying to teach. There's all this hidden curriculum, right? All these unintended messages that I'm teaching. But it's also the case that each of you come with unique lenses, right? You're all interpreting what I'm saying a little bit differently because of your own life experiences and perceptions and whatever. So you're never going to learn the same thing. You're never going to learn exactly what I'm trying to teach. There's always this space between what I'm teaching and what you're learning. Rather than close off that space and say that successful teaching is when there's an exact match, Ellsworth argues maybe we need to explore the possibilities of really grappling with this space between. What happens if we really take seriously that there will always be a difference between what I'm teaching and what you're learning? And I bring this up because I think sometimes we think it's really scary when we think about all that I cannot do as a teacher. I can never know everything about you. So if I'm being told I need to tailor my teaching to you, isn't that very intimidating? How do I do that? I can never learn everything about everything I'm teaching. And if I'm supposed to bring the critical perspective, how do I know I got it right? How do I know I got my facts right? How do I, you know? So it can become incredibly overwhelming until you tell yourself that maybe your job isn't to be the source of knowledge that is simply pouring into students' heads, right? If my job is to teach in a much more contradictory way, then the gaps of my knowledge is a part of my teaching.